The ontological argument is one of the most talked about arguments in the history of philosophy, and one of its most intriguing. Even one of the most prominent proponents of the argument, Alvin Plantinga, admits that probably very few have been convinced by it. Nevertheless, it can be difficult to see where exactly the argument goes wrong, or if it goes wrong at all. Graham Oppy states that the most interesting philosophical arguments are those which are valid. You seemingly can't fault any of the premises, yet still you want to deny the conclusion. This is where you have some work to do. I feel that this is the position that a lot of people find themselves in when looking at the ontological argument for the first time. Here I'm hoping not to cover the whole discussion about ontological arguments, as that would seemingly take a lifetime, but I want to look at one specific objection to one specific version of the argument. I should start by laying out that argument in question. So the one I'll be looking at is a formulation of Anselm's argument by Plantinga. I've taken this from Graham Oppy's argument about ontological arguments from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The argument goes as follows. God exists in the understanding, but not in reality. That's the assumption for reductio. Existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding alone. A being having all of God's properties plus existence in reality can be conceived. A being having all of God's properties plus existence in reality is greater than God. A being greater than God can be conceived. It is false that a being greater than God can be conceived. Hence it is false that God exists in the understanding, but not in reality. God exists in the understanding, hence God exists in reality. An intriguing idea, no doubt. One of the earliest and most well-known objections to this argument comes from the Benedictine monk Gaunilo. Gaunilo basically says that one can parody this argument for basically anything to show that a greatest possible X exists, where X is essentially whatever you like. Famously, he raised the idea of a greatest possible island. I want to forward an idea here that may or may not work, but I find interesting nonetheless. Suppose we said that the greatest possible island is one with the most amount of cookies. This seems immediately to run into the objection that the very idea is incoherent. William Lane Craig states the objection as follows.
When you look at these parodies of the argument, they turn out to involve things that are logically incoherent. For example, there is no such thing as the greatest possible island. You could always have more palm trees and more dancing girls on the island. And besides, what makes an island great is person relative. Do you prefer an island that is a desert island, remote from civilization, or do you prefer an island that's packed with the finest resort hotels? It's person relative.
He seems to say that asking about the greatest possible island is sort of like asking about the greatest possible number. The very question is incoherent, as there is no greatest possible number, and consequently there's no greatest possible island. That is not the case, however, with the greatest possible being, as God's power has a stopping point. He can do anything logically possible. He can't create a square circle, but he can create flying pigs if he wished, for instance. There is some nuance here, and some people argue that there are some logically possible worlds that God can't create, like a world in which God doesn't exist. But we'll set those aside for now. Plantinga argues the same way about God's omniscience. God simply knows all true propositions. There can be very significant pushback here in the form of Grimm's paradox of omniscience, or the fact that there are seemingly infinite amount of true propositions, like mathematical truths. If you want a great read about this specific point, I'll put a blog post by Alex Malpass on the topic in the description. But for the sake of argument, I'm actually going to grant this point, that there is a stopping point to God's knowledge. The objection I'm thinking of is a bit different. Let's consider this. God's omnipotence is the ability to actualize anything logically possible. I'm sure we would all agree that being able to actualize 2 cookies rather than just 1 is more powerful. But then we can imagine another even more powerful being who is able to actualize 12 cookies. And then another one on top of that able to actualize 3 cookies, and so on and so forth. So it seems like we have a parallel objection to the incoherency of the greatest possible island case. For no matter how many cookies God creates, there can be a God who creates 1 more, thus usurping the previous God. If the greatest possible island is incoherent, because you can always imagine an island with 1 more cookie, then why would omnipotence be any less incoherent, as you can always imagine a being who actualizes one more cookie than the previous so-called omnipotent being. There might be a way out of this, however. Let's say that rather than create a finite number of cookies, God creates an infinite amount of cookies. A strange idea, but it seems at least logically possible, and it also seems like it can avoid at least some of the issues of the previous example. For however many cookies you eat, if you start eating at some point in time, there'll still be an infinite amount of cookies left. You might want to also argue that God can't create more than an infinite amount of cookies. I want to briefly mention that there are some infinities that are bigger than other infinities, such as uncountable infinities as opposed to countable infinities. One may want to bring this up as a further objection by saying something like God 1 can create a countable infinity, but God 2 can create an uncountable infinity. But I want to set this aside for now as well, and grant the theist this too, that God can't create more than an infinite amount of cookies. Does that get God out of the incoherency of omnipotence? I'm not so sure, but I think that even if it does, it comes at a cost for those who are going to try to use it to salvage this version of the ontological argument. Why is this? Well, let's return to our greatest possible island case, which we previously concluded was incoherent due to the notion that however many cookies we can imagine that island having, we can imagine an island with one more cookie. Well, let's try the same thing as we did with God's omnipotence. Suppose that this island has an infinite amount of cookies in it. So it seems like Craig's objection to there always being an island with one more cookie on it is solved, because when you start eating cookies, for however many cookies you eat, there will still be an infinite amount left to eat. So here's the rub. If proponents of the ontological argument want to say that Gaunilo's island objection fails due to the incoherency of a greatest possible island, as you can always think of an island greater than the previous one, I've used a cookie to stand in the place of whatever it is that makes the island great. They would have to face the incoherency of omnipotent being creating the most amount of cookies, as you can always think of a being that creates one more. If they want to solve the problem by saying that God can create an infinite amount of cookies, then the island can have an infinite amount of cookies. So either one takes the view that a greatest number of cookies is incoherent, thus facing a problem when it comes to the greatest possible island, but also facing a similar problem when it comes to God's omnipotence. Or one grants the ability for God to create an infinite amount of cookies, solving this concern, but thus making their objection to the greatest possible island fail. My video here was very specific. It was targeted at a very specific objection to a very specific ontological argument. And it should be noted that this ontological argument is one of many, and a lot of people would argue that there are stronger ontological arguments, like the modal ontological argument. One could also argue that there are also stronger symmetry breakers between the two cases, so I certainly don't want to say that I've yeeted all ontological arguments away. The literature on this subject is vast and dizzying, and I certainly don't want to give the impression that this is a knockdown objection to all ontological arguments, or even this specific ontological argument. I just think, in my humble opinion, it's a fair response to this particular response to Gaunilo's original objection. I may make another video about ontological arguments in the future, as I find them fascinating, and a lot of philosophy comes to a head in these arguments, such as philosophy of language, philosophy of mathematics, infinities, existence, modality, and possible worlds. But that's all I have for now. If anyone has any comments or criticisms or questions, please let me know. Please like and subscribe, it helps me out a lot, and thank you very much. I'll see you later.